Hello. How are y'all doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. I can not hear you super well because I'm in the lab. I don't think people knew that I was going to be back from work already because I'm the only one in the lab right now, but that's okay. We're still going to cover this homework. Let me figure out how to share my screen. Okay. And first things first, we're going to go to the course website. And I'm just going to download the key. I actually already have it open in R, but I wanted to show out one way you could get started on just part 2 already. Well, let's get started. I'm going to knit to see where we're at. Okay, so we're starting with part 2. We want to get the measures of Democratic support in each precinct for each of our 3 races. You're asked to measure support as the percentage of votes in a precinct for the Democratic candidate out of all votes for candidates or write-ins. But this time, do not include blank votes or overvotes. Overvotes are where the voter indicated multiple choices in the overall vote count for the denominator. One hint is that a good approach here is to compute the total votes, the denominator for each precinct, and then merge something like the left join on the Democratic vote count for each race and the numerator, and then divide by the total votes. So it'll be something like this. Dem support is going to be equal to the Dem count divided by the total votes. In order to compute the candidate votes, one way I'd recommend is this one here. You don't necessarily need to do this in order to get this answer, but this is how I will be doing it. First, make a new data frame with the total number of votes cast for any actual candidates, including write-in each precinct and race. You will likely want to filter, followed by group by, and summarize using the sum of count variable. Second, make another data frame with the total number of votes for Democratic candidates in each precinct and race. You'll want to check the party of candidates and work only with the Democratic observations to get those vote counts. A hint here would be there are different Democratic parties for different races. Third, merge the total votes data with the Democratic votes data, then calculate a percent Democratic votes variable for each race. Okay, so let's get started doing all of that. Okay. So the first thing that we wanted to cover was making a new data frame with the total number of votes cast for any actual candidates, including write-ins. So let's start by seeing where we're at. So in this data set, for the one that I uploaded, I'm going to be using this King flag data frame. And this one, I'll just show you what it is real quick, has per precinct and race the candidates who got voted for, the write-ins, the times overvoted, times counted, etc., and the location variable. You'll recall that we made this location variable saying whether or not it was in Seattle or not. That's where I'm going to get started. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to know is using the King flag data. The unique combinations of race, party, and counter type. So I'm going to take the King flag data and then select those 3 variables and then see the distinct pairings. And when we look at this, oh my goodness. Yeah, when we look at this, we can see things like anything that says NP are not candidates. They're like other types of information, things like times overvoted, times counted, times blank voted. And anytime something doesn't say NP, it'll say like the party that this candidate is in. So that's a good piece of information for us to start with. I would also say we're not interested so much in these three things then, because times overvoted were invalid because there's too many candidates selected. Times counted is just the totals, but we want to be able to differentiate the candidates by party. And we also are not interested in the registered voters or the times blank voted here. We want to keep this kind of information and probably also write-ins in order to get the proper denominator. So we can start by, let's call this subset candidate rows. And we're going to take the king flag data and then filter party not equal to NP. And then select precinct location was party. We also want to keep counter type and the actual count, so the sum of count. And what does that look like? So looking at this, I forgot to include the write-ins. So I'm going to go back here to this line 334 here and say filter party not equal to NP, which was like the people who were not candidates, they were information, things like times counted, times overvoted. And I'm going to say or counter type equals write-in. And so what this will do is it will get rid of anything that doesn't have a party, or it'll keep the ones that are a write-in so that we can have the proper values. So like if we look at this data frame, we have these write-in votes. There are going to be very few of these, but they're important for us to keep in order to get the proper fraction. Oh, we should probably also assign this to something. So we'll call it candidate vote rows, and we'll assign it this whole thing. So we're going to make a new data frame like that. And I think that might be yeah, we're on the right path. And now we want to add up all of that information. So we're going to say, we're going to make a new code chunk and say candidates rows that we just made. And then we're going to group by the precinct, location, and the race. And then we'll summarize the total candidate votes are equal to the sum of count column. Okay, so this is a denominator here because we're going to be getting the total votes for anybody who is within a party and any write-in candidates. So we can see what that looks like. It'll say for the Adair precinct, which is not in Seattle, for the governor's race, there was 481 total votes. Oh, something in there. Oh, that's fine. Okay. Does that make sense? Folks at home, are we still following? Yes. Okay, cool. Yep, tight. I'm going to then we want to keep the Democrat rows specifically. So let's see how we would do that. We are going to make a new chunk and say something like our candidate vote rows. And then select, okay, I'm sorry. I got caught up. I forgot to make this its own data frame. So I'm going to go back up to line 341 and make this a data frame by making a total candidate votes and assigning it this like per precinct sum of all the stuff that will become our denominator. Okay, and then we wanted to get just the Democrat rows specifically in order to create our numerator. So if we look at the candidate vote rows and then select race, candidate vote rows. Did I misspell this? Misspelled it. Okay, so we can see that for like the governor's race, Jay Inslee is a Dem, and for Lieutenant Governor Cyrus Habib is a Dem, but for U.S. President and Vice President, Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine were in the DPN. So we are going to use both of these things in order to identify our Democrats here. So in order to identify them, I will make a new chunk and assign to the Democratic vote rows data frame our candidate vote rows type, filter, party, and we're going to use the percent and percent, make a vector with Dem and DPN in it. And then we're going to select precinct location. We still want to know if things are in Seattle or not. The race, and then the sum of count. And what's cool here is that we don't have to like group by and summarize because it's going to be just the Dem vote rows. So we can just say rename Dem votes equals the sum of count. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So you can see what I'm saying. Democratic. So here in the Adair precinct for the governor race, there was 256 Dem votes. And if we go back up here, yeah, we can see this in the governor race for, actually this doesn't have the precinct. We would need to go to, we'd have to look at that data. So let's do it this way. Capital VIEW, view, and then say candidate vote rows. We see that Jay Inslee had 256 in the Adair precinct. And then Cyrus Habib had 258. So let's see down here in our, for Cyrus Habib, there's 258. So I feel like we got the right information. And the last thing we wanted to do was make the fraction in order to get the correct turnout or the correct dem support variable. So we're going to make a new data frame that's going to be called Democrat vote rates and assign to it our Democratic vote rows. Did I misspell this? Democratic vote rows. And then we are going to left join our total candidate votes by the precinct and the location and the race. Okay, are we cool here with what's going on? We took the big data set and combined all of the votes for any of the legitimate votes for candidates to create our denominator. And then we filtered down that same information to just the dem votes to make our numerator. And now we're joining those two data frames back together in order to compute support as a percentage. Okay, and then we'll mutate, I'll say Democrat support, and I'm putting this in backticks so that we can have that nice space in it, is equal to dem votes divided by total candidate votes. And then select precinct, location, race, and Democrat. And if we look at the top of this, in the Adair precinct, Inslee got 53% of support among voters, and Sirius Aviv got 54%, and Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine got 56%, and so on and so on. Cool. So I'm going to knit that. And let's talk about the steps we took. So the first thing that we did is we looked at the unique combinations of race, party, and counter type in order to identify which things we wanted to keep and which ones we wanted to get rid of. So we said party not equal to NP because NP was mostly things like registered voters times blank counted. But we also wanted to keep the write-ins because that'll be part of our denominator. And then the next thing we did was we computed the total candidate vote rows by taking this information, grouping it by its location. So it's like precinct and location and the race, and then totaling up all of the write-ins, any votes for Dem candidates, any votes for Republican candidates, any votes for third-party candidates, and so on. The next thing we did was we looked at the unique combinations of race, party, and counter type in order to identify the Democrats, because for governor races and lieutenant governors, for some reason in this data set, it was under Dem, but for the president and vice president, it was under DPN. So we used that in order to filter down to just the Dem support rows. And rather than having to summarize, since the summary was already handled by filtering to the information we wanted, we only had to rename this column in order to get the total votes that we needed for Dem candidates. And then we combined that data, that Democrat votes rows, with the total votes rows in order to compute Dem support. Moving on to combining it all. Once you've calculated Democratic voting percentages for each race, you'll want to put them back together with the precinct turnout rate data using a join. So the turnout rate data was created earlier. In this, if you copied the template for the homework part 5, part 1, it'll be under this turnout rates data frame. If you approached it some other way, or are just using your homework from last week, whatever you named in order to get the last question, that'll be your turnout rates we'll be using in this section. But we're going to combine them with a join. Then you'll want to make sure that your data is shaped as I recommend above. So 1 row per precinct with columns for each of the relevant measures. If your data are in a format where each row for each race within a precinct, i.e. like long format, you may find the pivot wider command useful for turning multiple rows for each precinct into single precinct rows with different columns for each race. So let's get started. Let's see, we want to make, we're going to take the turnout rates data and then left join our Democrat votes by precinct and the location. Yeah, so that way we can have per race the turnout rate and the Democrat vote rate. So let's see, turnout rate's not found. Did I not already run this up here? Okay, so now what we have is per precinct, we have the race and the Dem support for each race, as well as the turnout rate within that precinct. So I'm going to assign that to precinct data. And we'll say head precinct data so that later we can see it. But we also want the turning multiple rows for each precinct into a single precinct row with different columns for each race. So we want to do this part. In order to do that, let me make a new chunk. And we'll say precinct data, and then move it wider. We want to have the names from the race column and the values from the Democrat support column. So now what our data will look like is there's 1 row per precinct, and we have 1 row or 1 column per race. Okay, so we've made our data wider by collapsing our rows into 1 row per precinct. So let's go ahead and assign that to wide precinct data. And also, I don't like how long the names are, so I'm just going to rename them. Trying to recall what the other ones were called. Okay, governors, fine, but the let's do backticks LT dot governor equals lieutenant I hope I spelled that right. We'll see. And then we'll just say president is equal to US president and vice president. And data. Cool. A lot easier on the eyes. I think that might be it before graphing the results. We have one row per precinct with a column for each of the Dem supports in each of the races. So let's move on to graphing. I'm going to knit so that we can read the instructions. Okay. So what we did here was we combined our turnout rates data and the Democrat vote rates in order to get the, oh goodness, it got cut off here, but the Dem support per precinct and race next to the turnout rate for that precinct. And then we made it wider in order to get turnout next to the Dem support for each particular race. And now we're going to graph the results. We're going to make a scatter plot where the horizontal axis is number of registered voters in the precinct, and the vertical axis is the turnout rate. The color is going to be the precincts in Seattle with one color, and use a different color for the other ones. Okay. Seems pretty straightforward. We are going to say, I'm going to make a GG plot. Our data is going to be the last thing we made, so the wide precinct data. It's just going to be this plot. So our aesthetics is going to be X equals the registered voters. I believe it's just called registered voters in the data set. And then our y-axis is going to be the turnout. I'd like to check though. So I'm going to go down here and say glimpse wide precinct data. A quick look at, yeah, this is just called turnout. So we're going to say turnout, but we're going to say turnout times 100 so that it's like as a percentage instead of as a probability. And then we also wanted to color by location, which is just Seattle or not Seattle. And we also wanted to group by location. And we wanted to add a layer for a geom point. So let's see what that looks like as is. Okay. Looks like Seattle tends to have slightly higher turnout rates. That's kind of interesting. What does this say? Remove 2 rows containing missing values. I think those 2 rows don't have any registered voters, if I recall correctly. But let's make this plot a little bit nicer. So we're going to set the alpha to 0.4. So this will make each dot a little bit more transparent. And then we'll make the dots slightly bigger by saying size equals 1. We can add on smoothers. So we could say geom smooth and method equals OS. Okay, so like what I thought originally with the maybe there's slightly higher turnout in Seattle precincts appears to hold up to the scrutiny of this low S smoothing. And then we can add things like I don't know, a title. We could say turnout rates by precinct in King County. 2016. We can add X label. Registered voters, I think, is probably fine. Let's change Y label from turnout times 100 to turnout percent of registered voters voting in presidential race. That looks like. It looks cramped. We could add a \n here so that turnout is now on top of those words, and I think that makes it a little bit easier to see. I also really don't like the background gray, so we could say theme black and white. It seems to be coming along. I also like to change the colors. So here I'm going to add a scale color manual and say the values equal, and I'm just going to pick 2 regular colors. Let's say orange and blue. That's nice. Maybe we could change the breaks. Say something like scale Y continuous. Breaks are going to equal sequence 0 to 100 by 10. So now we have a better sense of the difference between this dot and this dot, for instance. I'm going to call that good. I think this is a pretty decent plot. Let's move on. So I'm going to knit. Okay. I'd say before I turn this in, I would get rid of these warnings and messages by changing the code chunk options. But for now, I just want to see this plot looking nice and read the instructions for the next part. So lastly, let's visualize the Democrat support rates for 3 races within each precinct for sufficiently large precincts. So we're going to limit data to precincts with at least 500 registered voters using filter. We're going to make a line plot where the horizontal axis indicates precincts. The vertical axis shows the Democratic support rates. There should be 3 lines in different colors, 1 for each race of interest. Do not label the precincts on the horizontal axis using this piece of code here. You should, however, arrange them on the axis in order from smallest to largest. In terms of support for the Democratic candidate for president, that is the line plotting percentage support for Obama, that's a typo, for Clinton, should be smoothly increasing from left to right. The order of the lines in the legend should follow the order of the lines at the right edge of the plot. To do this, we need to use the wide version of the data, so the one where it's 1 row per precinct, and order precinct based on the Democratic support for the presidential race. You may want to use the forcats factor reorder function on the precinct variable. Then we can reshape back from wide to tidy using pivot longer so that we have 1 variable giving the race and another one giving vote percentage. And then we can plot a separate line for each of the races. Okay. So started typing that. Okay, so we want to be able to first, for sufficiently large races, figure out where we're going. So we're going to say make tidy big precinct data. we're going to assign to that our wide precinct data. Excuse me. And then we'll filter our registered voters variable as greater than or equal to 500. And then what we wanted to do was reorder based on Dem support in the race. So we'll say, and then mutate precinct variable is going to be equal to the factor reorder precinct by the president column. So recall our president column was the Dem, had the percentage of Dem support for Clinton and Kane. So we're going to reorder the factor of the precinct variable from lowest to greatest by the president variable. And then, actually, let's just see what that looks like right now. So know where we're at. So now the only precincts here have at least 500 registered voters. And if we wanted a sense of the levels, we could go down to the console and say, glimpse. Actually, we would have to go like this. And then precincts not found. I see. This computer has slightly different settings for the console than mine back home, so don't mind me as I make a mistake. But yeah, we take the wide precinct data and then we filter to greater than or equal to 500. And then we reorder the precinct variable. And then what was next? We have to make it tidy in order to plot. So we are going to then pivot longer. And we're going to take, I think we pivot, trying to remember exactly how pivot. So the columns that we're going to be pivoting are governor, lieutenant governor, and president. The values are going to now be called Democrat support. And the name of our new column is going to be called race. Names to, this is supposed to be in quotes. Give me a second. I'm used to using the old version of the same thing, so I'm gonna have to look into how this works. So we pivot longer. The columns that we want to pivot longer are the governor, lieutenant, governor, and president. And yeah, now I want to change this from saying name and this from saying value to something else. So what is the way that you do that without having to do a separate rename column? String specifying the name of the column to create from the data and cell values. Okay, so let's try this. Say race. Race. And then and let's say I don't know what happened there. I feel like I did it right. Maybe I spliced a comma or something. Who knows? I mean, y'all have the like luxury of being able to watch this on the internet, so maybe you can just rewind and see what I did wrong. Okay, great. So that means the data is how we'd like it to be. I'll show you again how ggplot likes longer data sets. So since we want to know the differences between our race for governor, lieutenant governor, and president, they are in their own column. This will make it easier later. So let's make this ggplot. Ggplot is going to take the data, the tidy, big precinct data. On the x-axis, it's going to take the precincts. And since we already reordered them, like that's just going to be taken care of for us. Our y-axis is going to be Democrat support times 100. Our group is going to be the race. Our color is going to be the race. So this is how our ggplot is going to start. And then it's going to be a line plot. Let's see what this looks like. Okay. This is what it looks like so far. Recall how I said, like, you want to get rid of the x-axis? This is why. It's because these are all words that have overlapped on top of each other and now are just like a big hot mess. What we should do is steal that piece of code, scale x discrete, breaks equals null. And now that's gone. We don't have to worry about that. Cool. We probably also want to add some transparency to this. 0.1 is way too little. Let's do 0.5. Okay. And then we can probably add title. Title, Democratic support in 3 races. \n to do a line break in the title. County 2016, large precincts only. Okay. And let's say we can add to scale x discrete. Name equals precinct ordered by Clinton. That looks like, yeah, this needs okay. Then we can add scale color manually and have the values equal to black, red, and blue. That's like pretty solid, kind of a little bit UGA, but that's okay. And black and white. That's one way you could do it, to have 3 dimensions of information shown by a line plot. Alternatively, you could do a scatter plot. So I'll do that one just really quickly. But that's kind of it for the homework. So I'll show you that one. ggplot data equals ID big precinct data, and our aesthetics are for the precinct. Race, and then geom point, right? Alpha to be like 0.3, and the size to equal like 0.7. We still want the scale x discrete race equals null, since it's just going to show us the precincts. And we can say scale y continuous equals sequence from 30 to 100 by 10. So these are a little bit more legible. And add a black and white. And then just go through and change the titles and things. And I think this plot will be ready to go. But that's about it for the homework. Thank you all so much. Do we have any questions? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. I will see you all on Thursday.